Thanks, and a real privilege to be with you all today. And let me commend particularly KAC, Jerry, and Harry for the incredible leadership that they've provided in getting the kind of material, the kind of mobilization that we now have. That is one of the few serious counters to some of the stuff we're seeing coming out of WHO and Bloomberg-funded entities. So, I was reflecting, what do I really have to offer? And I think often just a little bit of a historical background may help people fill in some gaps that they may not be aware of. And I lived a lot of them, so I know what was actually happening in some of the periods. Not all. I was too young for the 1962 report of the Royal College of Physicians that actually started it all. But let me go back to 1970. 1970 was a very important year. It was the very first time that a resolution came to the floor of the World Health Organization where it had wording saying that smoking kills and action is needed. It was based really on two major international reports, the Royal College of Physicians report of 1962 and the Surgeon General's report of 1964. And remember, both of those reports were led by doctor-based organizations. It was the Royal College of Physicians from this country that was the very first call for serious international action. And I'm going to come back to that all these years later. Very interestingly, the resolution, there was a bit of a debate and it passed, and an advisory board was set up. And most of the members, in fact, all of them, have sadly died. One of the original members of that task force is alive and at 90, still active. Many of you know him, Lars Ramstam, the person who almost single-handedly has carried the banner for one of the key components of reduced risk, namely snus, over the decades, often at considerable critique, and finally to be vindicated when the FDA authorized generalized snus as being appropriate for the protection of public health. Mea culpa, during the years I was at WHO, and he and the Swedes would come and bring their data, we said, well, this is just industry stuff, must be dismissed. Well, since that very first resolution, there were many resolutions. In fact, in the content areas of WHO, there are very few areas where you've had as many resolutions on a topic as you have for tobacco control. And they were slowly building the basis of what became the components of the Framework Convention. So after a few years, you had one on advertising and efforts to try and ban advertising. You had others looking at smoke-free public places. You had focusing on kids and children. You had issues related to taxation and what was the appropriate approach going forward. I think what was interesting is that over those many years, it was 25 years, there was a slow build-up among governments that this was in fact an important public health issue. And remember that for the world, the dominant issues they thought were mainly infectious diseases or issues related to undernutrition and hunger. There was virtually no interest or support for serious chronic diseases and their determinants. Things like cancer, cardiovascular disease, mental health, chronic lung diseases were not a priority, whereas measles, tuberculosis, undernutrition, and so on were the priorities. And in many reasons, that was probably right, because that is what we were seeing the epidemiology drive deaths and disease, particularly in the low middle income countries. But tobacco led the way in saying that this next set of decades is going to be one dominated by chronic diseases. And the number one risk factor, tobacco, better be top of our list. Over that period, there were a few governments who showed leadership right from the beginning. And they included the United Kingdom, they included Norway, they included Canada. And I mention them because people often don't realize that without the support of the Canadian government, there probably would be no Framework Convention. It was the Canadian government that provided the support to the WHO to have the staffing, to do the analytic work, to originally have some of the stuff. And of course, the other interesting thing is that the governments who pushed hardest for regulations and legislation were those that had the best regulatory capacity to enforce them. And if I was to say, looking back, the one error that we all made was not to think more deeply about how does this piece of legislation or regulation work in a low middle income countries? Was there an explicit focus on saying, if you ban sales to children, but children are selling to children in low middle income countries, how on earth is that going to be enforceable? Or how are you going to enforce many of the tax desires in a country where there is zero capacity for addressing illicit trade or customs strength? That was never an issue within WHO. The thought about the implementation problems was put on the governments, and hopefully somehow miraculously they would deal with them. They were never funded to do it. And that's why we are at the position we get to today. So this build-up happened. By 1998, the start of the negotiations happened. And I would say that one of the biggest things that, if we look back to 1998, that was interesting is that we led the negotiations by bringing the tobacco industry into the hallowed halls of WHO to ask the scientists what did they think they would have in their armamentarium to address harm reduction and the product itself. So we had BAT, Philip Morris, one or two other companies, JT, actually present, can you imagine this, in a WHO building to WHO officials plus external consultants on the record. And their presentations were what they were at the time, 20 years ago. They were not too impressive. The level of science hadn't developed. And our view was really to listen to them to say, well, that's the last time we listened to them, and that's what happened. And WHO walked away from the potential to say maybe the innovation cycle was going to continue. If you fast forward to where we are now, we have colleagues, Roya Gahali, out of a program out of Oxford, a leading patent attorney and lawyer, has put out a report showing that in the last decade, 75,000 patents have been filed in the area of reduced-risk products, most of them related to harm reduction products that form the components of e-cigarettes or heated tobacco products. And some of them even going further, looking at adjacent uses for nicotine or for the heating devices to improve public health and medicine. Despite all that, if you read the text, the word patent and intellectual property does not exist once in the structure of the Framework Convention. At exactly the same time that was being negotiated, the hottest issue in Geneva was patents and intellectual property related to HIV/AIDS drugs, where the WTO was in a major battle with a number of the companies, and my own country at the time, South Africa and Brazil, were pushing hard to actually make sure that access to science and technology would save lives, and eventually that won out. How is it possible that we were so blinkered? And the reason is because we never in our wildest dreams imagined that true innovation, transformation of the core product that was killing, would actually be transformed through science, technology, and innovation to no longer kill and held the potential to accelerate an end to smoking. If we jump to 2005, by 2005 the treaty was adopted. 180 countries signed on very quickly. And I went back to my comments I made at an SR&T meeting in Prague that year, where I was asked, so what do you think the road ahead is going to be? And I really raised three concerns. One was complacency, that the energy and the excitement, difficult to imagine, around building a treaty, getting text, and some of you in the audience were there with us in different ways, would dissipate fast. And instead a bureaucracy would take over, a bureaucratic mindset would take over, the passion would be gone, the focus on people, on smokers, the focus on cancer, heart disease, and many of the actual diseases would actually would disappear, and the vague term tobacco control would take over. The whole purpose of the Framework Convention is to prevent diseases and death, specific diseases, specific causes of deaths, but we don't talk about those anymore. And what happened is the American Cancer Society went quiet and sort of walked away. The American Heart Association didn't really do much more because they didn't feel they were part of the objective. So the first thing I said was complacency, and I fear that did set in. And 15 years later, we see the signs of it. Secondly, I raised the fact that by 2005, we were starting to see the emergence of what could be harm reduction products which could save lives. We needed to keep our eye on the ball. We needed to engage with that community, regardless of where the science was coming from. And I didn't really know much about it, and made the comment, wrote about it, and went on with my life. The third one was, there would be no progress without serious money and investment by low middle income countries and by the international development community into tobacco control. That never happened. I would say, luckily, and I mean it sincerely, Bloomberg did come up with a lot of money for some of the elements, and I think for that, you've got to actually praise him, that through the Bloomberg philanthropy, you probably have more activity in a number of countries related to taxation, even though the progress has been incredibly slow and bad. Raising awareness, putting tobacco on the map. None of that would happen if they didn't have the dollars. The problem was the enormous damaging blind spot on the tools and the means to end the actual killing and the deaths. So let's jump to 2015, which was the next year of significance to me. And in 2015, I was asked by Spectator Health here in the UK to write a piece on what was going on in the e-cigarette world. I was at a group called Vitality, who many of you in the UK will know. It gets you active and incentivizes healthy behavior, and there's a great dachshund to try and persuade you to join the cause. And we were not making progress enough on tobacco, doing well on activity. So I undertook the challenge and reviewed the evidence, and I was shocked that I'd walked away. I'd been out of tobacco control intensively for a decade, and what had happened was millions of people were using e-cigarettes across Europe with great success. Snus, the data that we'd seen before, was starting to actually spread well beyond Sweden. The death rates were down. Swedish men were now dying by far at the lowest rate of cancers. And this all suggested that the harm reduction world was about to start seeing a dramatic increase in interest. Of course, I was late to the party. I had many colleagues, people like Clive Bates and Dylan Human and David Sweener, had been warning this was coming and we weren't paying enough attention. But most in public health dismissed all that. And that was the reason, that was the fundamental reason I went ahead with the foundation. It was because we never before had a technology opportunity to bring the deaths down. And I knew then that if we succeeded, we would actually make the biggest public health impact that we would ever be able to make in our lives. And who on earth would not want to be part of that? So we went ahead. And now let's jump to 2021 and where we are and where we go forward. First of all, one thing we all learned in the pandemic is to look at the projections. You know, every day these grim projections, you know, the numbers have gone up, the deaths have gone up, and people didn't just talk about them. In some parts of the world, they actually looked at the projections and said, we better double down on masks and social distancing. We better increase our vaccine. There was action based on the projections. You heard what Harry said. 1 billion people are set to die this century if we continue with our trends. 8 million people are dying this year. The thing about tobacco control and the outcome is that it's much more secure to project future deaths because the epidemiology of what happens when you smoke and later die is pretty certain. So when you see projections, you better act on them. But where's the action? Oh, isn't it interesting? We have 8 million people dying this year, and if we continue, blah, 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 blah. Instead of saying, my God, we've got to reverse these trends. We've got to have greater passion, greater activity. And I think that, I hope, is the lesson that people take from the report, that the chance to act remains here, but the results will only be seen 15, 20 years from now, which means we have to tolerate delayed satisfaction in this game compared to COVID, where you see the changes almost overnight. So what are the positive signs? I think the Royal College of Physicians report this year, going back to it, you know, all those decades later, is now leading the world with physicians saying use e-cigarettes as part of your armamentarium. The commonest way people are quitting is through e-cigarettes. Use them, and I'm sure that when they look at the other opportunities, they will see the same. That message needs to be globalized. Nowhere in the world do you see the smoking rate go down among the general population before it first goes down among the doctors. And the gap is usually a decade. Nowhere in the world. Look at China. The smoking rate among doctors is 50%. The smoking rate in men is 50%. In Indonesia, the figures are 60, 65% for both. If the doctors don't lead, the population will not follow, the population will not act. we have forgotten about the doctors. We've forgotten about their leadership. They played decisive roles before, and they need to return to that role. Second, the FDA. I'm sitting in the UK. The FDA still matters. It's probably the most powerful regulatory science body we have on the planet. It's something we look to for pharmaceutical decisions, for drug decisions, for medical device. I sat on some of their global food safety. We know that their global safety standards become the global norm. There are virtually no examples of an FDA decision that does not become the global norm. There are one or two, but they're peculiar. So the question is, how long will it take for the US government to actually talk more rigorously and vigorously about the authorizations they've had for snus, for VUS, and for IQOS, all authorized as appropriate for the protection of public health? Usually what happens is the US government makes a decision, it authorizes its embassies to actually get out and tell and explain to the people in country why they made this decision. What is the underlying science? What's the benefit to the population? They should be proud of it. It's a fantastic decision. Don't let it sit in the US and fester. Let it become part of the global debate and the global norm. Combine that with the Royal College of Physicians report and the Doctor's Voice of the UK, and you have two incredibly important countries respected around the world in a position to actually influence the debate. On the user side, as Harry said, never before did we think we'd have 100 million people using the range of products, from snus to heated tobacco products to e-cigarettes and a wide range of other vapes. Their voice clearly needs to be more activated and allowed to be present. Remember what we learned from HIV/AIDS. It was when the patients and the people who had AIDS who spoke up and organized and said, nothing for us without us, action followed. That's starting to be said in this community, but I don't see the passion, I don't see the organized focus and discussion yet, because those voices have been so dampened down, the smoker has been so stigmatized, the smoker has been so excluded from the debate, deliberately expunged from the debate, that they no longer seem that they have a voice. And then on to the companies. We are so cautious and careful about saying, we don't talk about company X, Y, and Z, and you don't want to. Well, let's just take one very quick look, and I'm nearly there, Will, to take one quick look at the internal combustion engine debate. What's going on there? You have President Xi of China saying he wants to end the sale of the internal combustion engine, I think he said within a decade. You have President Biden making similar comments about where he wants the US to be 15 years from now. Of course, China can do a lot by control. The US has got to stimulate market forces. What are the companies doing? Well, many of them are way out front. If you've got companies like Swedish Match getting 40% of their revenue from reduced risk products, PMI is now at 30%, BAT is at 12%, that's a pretty good starting point from zero not too long ago. Why aren't we getting out there and saying they are the equivalent of Ford and General Motors and Volvo, all actually saying we want to end the internal combustion engine? And what is happening to them? Governments adjust their regulations to make it easier for them to actually get out and make it easier for consumers to buy these products. But that isn't all. We have the equivalent of Teslas. We all praise Teslas doing a fantastic job, but nobody says Tesla should be given even more praise than GM getting out of internal combustion engine. Tesla's been on the front end, but it's no longer the largest contributor to reduced risk products. So who are the Teslas? Smur, a country coming out of China at us around the world with a market capitalization far greater than Juul. Most people never talks about them. Relax, another company based out of Singapore. And of course, Juul. And remember, between them, initially, none of them had any tobacco industry ties. Juul, of course, does. The other two don't. But is that the point? The point is they are leading the way out of combustibles with products, with marketing, with strategies. Surely the government should say, let's make it easier for them. And the way to do it is to make sure that you have your regulations proportionate to the risk of the product, something I think we'll talk about lastly. So let me just end by saying, when I look forward, I hope that we recognize that this will be a holding year. The best that can be achieved at COP9 is not much. We hope it's a year of relative silence. It's a year of a lot of noting and nodding, but it's a year when the member states finally start seeing that if you've got 100 million users, if you've got FDA authorizations all over the place and many more to come, if you've got the Royal College of Physicians and doctors starting to see it, if you've got the distortion on the knowledge of nicotine that you have, surely the time's come to change course and actually address what could be preventing the largest cause of death in the world. Thank you.